Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Friday program. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis, and today we are honored to host Marjorie Cohn to talk about reclaiming Judaism from Zionism. Marjorie is an American legal scholar and professor at the Thomas Jefferson School of Law in San Diego. She is the former president of the National Lawyers Guild and has served as legal and political commentator on the BBC, CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and writes columns for Truth Out, Common Dreams, Consortium News, and others. Her most recent book actually is Drones and Targeted Killing, Legal, Moral, and Geopolitical Issues. It also includes an introduction by Desmond Tutu. She is a contributor too to the book that she'll be talking about today, Reclaiming Judaism from Zionism, Stories of Personal Transformation. This is an extraordinary collection of true life stories told with self-reflective honesty, probing intelligence, and really heartfelt empathy. I highly recommend it to everyone who hears this program. It speaks to our humanity and to our ability to rise above the knee-jerk reactions that are not only expected of us, but are in many cases demanded of us. So it's an incredible book. And I want to welcome you, Margie, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Georgia, for inviting me to address the Praxis Peace Institute once again. Today, this very day, marks 8 months since Israel began its genocidal campaign against the Palestinians in Gaza. Millions of people around the world have mobilized to stop the carnage. There have been more than 3,700 days with pro-Palestinian protests at more than 500 U.S. schools since October 7th, 2023, including encampments at more than 130 of them. The International Court of Justice, or the ICJ, found a plausible case that Israel is committing genocide. And the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, asked the court to issue arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and 3 Hamas leaders for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Joe Biden called the prospect of warrants against Israeli officials outrageous. Virtually all GOP House members and a large number of Democrats voted to sanction the ICC for considering arrest warrants against top Israeli leaders. Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir called the ICJ anti-Semitic for ordering provisional measures against Israel. Netanyahu called the request to the ICC for arrest warrants the new anti-Semitism. Allegations that anti-Zionism, which is criticism of Israel, is anti-Semitic are ubiquitous but false. Anti-Semitism is a real problem, but it has been weaponized to stifle protected speech in support of the Palestinians, which actually undermines efforts to combat real anti-Semitism. In this book, Reclaiming Judaism from Zionism, Carolyn Karcher has assembled contributions from 50 Jews, including me. Nearly all of the contributors previously identified themselves as Zionists. We come from diverse backgrounds: Ashkenazi Jews from Russia and Central, West, and Eastern Europe, Sephardi or Mizrahi Jews, Iberian, South European, Near Asian, and Arab Jews, and Jews of color, rabbis and laypersons, religious and secular, LGBTQ and straight, academics and students, older and younger. I won't tell you which category I fit into among the latter, but I will draw on the introduction and the afterword to this book to provide you with a brief history of Zionism and anti-Zionism. And then I will say a few words about my own contribution to this collection. Zionism is a political ideology of Jewish nationalism. Judaism is a religion. Zionism is based on the belief that Israel is a haven where Jews can remain safe from persecution, and nothing but a state controlled by Jews for Jews can protect them against anti-Semitism and the threat of another Holocaust. In the 1880s, Russian Jews were targeted in pogroms at the hands of state-sanctioned anti-Semitic mobs. Most Russian Jews who sought to escape oppression by emigrating headed either to Western Europe or the United States. A smaller number chose to fight for their rights at home by joining revolutionary movements, the largest of which was the militantly secularist anti-Zionist Bund. Zionism gained significant traction after being embraced by the Viennese Jew Theodor Herzl at the end of the 19th century. The Jews of Central and Western Europe, unlike their Russian counterparts, defined their national identity as Austrian, German, French, or British rather than Jewish, and they regarded Judaism as a religion, not a nationality or an ethnic group. Herzl initially shared the optimism about the possibility of Jews enjoying full equality as citizens in their respective countries. Yet by the mid-1880s, disturbing trends were undermining reasons for optimism. As a flood of Russian Jewish refugees from the pogroms overwhelmed Central and Western Europe, they met with the same hostility that 21st century Muslim refugees would later encounter. Anti-Semites labeled Jews a race in the sense that the racist theorists of 19th century Europe were given this word. On the other hand, large sections of the Jewish world came to accept and even to claim that they belonged to this imaginary Jewish race. Herzl concluded that anti-Semitism would never abate as long as Jews lived in Europe, where they would always occupy the status of unassimilable minorities within nations striving for homogeneous ethnic identity. The only solution, he decided, would be for the Jews to found a nation of their own elsewhere. Herzl published his famous pamphlet, The Jewish State, in 1896, which became the manifesto of the Zionist movement. The following year, he convened the first meeting of the World Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. In spelling out how he envisaged establishing a Jewish state, Herzl made clear that he was modeling his venture on European colonialism. He proposed organizing a society of Jews under the protectorate of the European powers. Like other European colonials, he gave no thought to the native inhabitants of the land to be acquired. Modern-day Israel still adheres to Herzl's vision, which set the stage for the century-long conflict between Jewish and Palestinian nationalism. The period from 1904 to 1914, referred to by historians as the Second Aliyah, saw the emigration to Palestine of key Zionist leaders, among them David Ben-Gurion. They set about creating the institutions and infrastructure of a Jewish state and contemplating ways of transferring the native population of Palestine to neighboring Arab lands to make room for more Jewish settlers who so far amounted to only 5% of the inhabitants. In Britain, Zionist spokesman Chaim Weizmann gained the ear of Arthur James Balfour, who, as prime minister in 1905, had opposed opening Britain's door to Russian Jews fleeing the pogroms, but who greeted the idea of directing the refugees toward Palestine as a welcome alternative. He, and later Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who appointed Balfour foreign minister, favored the prospect of a Jewish protectorate to British holdings in the Near East. They shared the fundamentalist Christian belief that the restoration of the Jews to Palestine would hasten the second coming of Christ, a belief still held today by 21st century Christian Zionists. Balfour traveled to the US to win President Woodrow Wilson's support for turning Palestine into a British protectorate that would serve as a national home for the Jewish people, The most prominent and influential spokesman for American Zionists was Louis Brandeis, whom Wilson had nominated to the US Supreme Court in 1916. Balfour approached Wilson through Brandeis. With Wilson's blessing, Balfour returned to Britain to hammer out the infamous Balfour Declaration. Its final draft, negotiated between British Zionist leaders and government officials, read in part, "His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country." The Balfour Declaration marked an enormous advance for the Zionist cause. American Jewish leaders voiced strong condemnation of Zionist aims and ideology because they found it contrary to the principles of democracy to elevate Jewish immigrants over Palestine's Muslim and Christian native inhabitants. In 1919, they explicitly denied the existence of ethnic ties among Jews and asserted their wish not to see Palestine, either now or at any time in the future, become a Jewish state. They petitioned instead for Palestine to be made into an independent, free, and democratic state that would not recognize any distinctions of creed, race, or ethnic descent among its citizens. In 1922, Rabbi David Phillipson emphasized that Zionists do not speak for all Jews. He particularly rejected the characterization of Palestine as the national home of the Jewish people. No land can be spoken of as the national home of the Jewish people, he said, as Jews are nationals of many lands. Phillipson wrote, "Reform Judaism is spiritual. Zionism is political. Reform Judaism is universal. Zionism is particularistic. Reform Judaism looks to the future, Zionism to the past." The future to which Reform Jews looked was one in which they could assimilate fully into American life on the same footing as Christians while retaining their Jewish faith. And the past they feared that Zionism would revive was one of ghettoization, discrimination, and treatment as aliens. American Reform Jews thought that if they defined Jews as a national group rather than a religion, they would be inviting the same kind of anti-Semitism based on nationality that Eastern European Jews had suffered. They were eager to counter any charges of dual loyalty to an American and Jewish nation in order to smooth their past into the highest reaches of American society. Louis Brandeis assured American Jews that they could be Zionists without having any intention of moving to Palestine themselves. Brandeis also defined Jewish nationality in terms as compatible with Americanism as the nationality of Irish or Italian Americans, all of whom, he insisted, could be better Americans by supporting their homes overseas. Brandeis and his friends, including Felix Frankfurter, who would succeed Brandeis on the Supreme Court, were outspoken defenders of the poor, the oppressed, and the disenfranchised in the US, but saw Palestine's Arabs largely through the prism of Western colonialism and Jewish nationalism. This was a reflection of the imperial mindset that both European colonialism and the US ideology of manifest destiny had inculcated in American Zionists. Because the ideology of manifest destiny celebrated the American settlers' displacement of the continent's native inhabitants as a triumph of civilization over savagery, Brandeis and his fellow Zionists saw the precedent as justifying Jews displacing Arabs in Palestine. But the most decisive factor was the spread of Nazism in the 1930s and the Holocaust. The Zionists claimed that anti-Semitism could never be eradicated and that only a Jewish state in their ancestral homeland could provide a secure refuge became more and more persuasive. The original sin, if you will, of the United Nations was when it voted in November 1947 with the decisive support of the Soviet Union and the communist bloc countries to partition Palestine between a Jewish and an Arab state. Although Jews owned less than 6% of the total land area of Palestine and made up no more than 1/3 of the population, they were given 56% of the overall territory, including the most fertile land. In early December 1947, the Zionists began the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians and committed atrocities, including mass executions and torture. Tens of thousands of well-trained Jewish troops faced only a few thousand irregular Palestinians and Arabs. In March 1948, the Haganah adopted a blueprint for ethnic cleansing. It was called Plan Dalet, and it included terrorizing the population through massacres that provoked mass flight, driving Palestinians out of villages and urban centers, and reducing nearly all the structures in the depopulated areas to rubble. What does that sound like? When the British withdrew from Palestine, Israel declared independence and the first Arab armies entered Palestine. Zionist troops had already expelled 250,000 Palestinians. That number would rise to between 700,000 and 800,000 when the campaign of ethnic cleansing finally ended in the summer of 1949. Although in 1948, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted Resolution 194, for which even the United States voted, that called for the unconditional repatriation of Palestinian refugees, it has never been implemented. When Zionists did not succeed in luring Sephardi Jews to Israel with promises of a better life, they sometimes resorted to violent means. They were trying to fill up Israel with Jews. Although subjected, like Palestinians, to forced displacement and the confiscation of their property, Sephardi Jews did not undergo anything comparable to the violence of the Nakba, which is the Arabic word for catastrophe, that refers to the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1947 to 48. From the early days of Zionism, Sephardim were perceived as a source of cheap labor that had to be maneuvered into emigrating to Palestine. To implement the Zionist goal of replacing Arab labor with Jewish labor, the pioneers imported Jews from Yemen in 1912. Housed in inhuman conditions, they imported Yemeni agricultural workers who were often beaten by their employers and overseers. These are Jews, Yemeni Jews. They succumbed as well to disease and death caused by malnutrition and poor sanitation. Because the Zionists, most of whom were Ashkenazi or white, regarded the Yemenis as bereft of all culture, history, or material achievement, they not only considered it legitimate to abuse Yemenis, but they also excluded them from the socialist benefits accorded European workers. The treatment of the Yemeni Jews imported in 1912 provided a template for the 600,000 Sephardi refugees who arrived in the wake of the Palestinian Nakba. They were segregated in remote rural areas and frontier regions or crammed into poor urban neighborhoods and systematically discriminated against in terms of infrastructural needs, educational and cultural advantages, and political self-representation. One of the essays in this book, Reclaiming Judaism from Zionism, discusses the children's affair. Again, I was telling you how Israel was trying to fill up Israel with Jews. And so they basically imported a lot of non-white Jews, a lot of Arabs from Iraq and Yemen and other Arab countries as well. And the Yemenite children's affair, which was a scandal that was only recently uncovered, was a situation where a Yemeni family would arrive in Israel. And if the mother had a baby, a suckling baby or a young baby, a woman who was dressed in a nurse's costume would come out and say, we need to take your baby, to the hospital and do some tests. And so we'll be right back. And that woman never saw her child again. And this happened to thousands and thousands and thousands of Yemeni families. What the Ashkenazi Jews who were in charge of Israel would do was basically kidnap Yemeni babies. And it wasn't just Yemenis, it was Iraqi babies and other non-white babies, and adopt them off to Ashkenazi families who couldn't have children. An absolute outrage. In June 1967, Israel, falsely claiming self-defense, attacked Egypt, Jordan, and Syria and seized the Palestinian territories of the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem, as well as the Golan Heights and the Sinai Peninsula. Despite the decision not to repeat the mass expulsion of 1948, some 280,000 to 325,000 Palestinians were uprooted in 1967, many for the second time, in what Palestinians call the Naksa, or defeat. It ushered in Israel's prolonged occupation of Palestinian territory. UN Security Council Resolution 242, however, which was passed in 1967 and reaffirmed in 2016, stipulates the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war. But we know that Israel doesn't pay attention to international law. The 1967 Six-Day War marked a turning point for both Israel and American Jews. Israel was now firmly committed to colonizing the West Bank and Gaza under a dual legal system, civil law for Jewish Israelis and military law for Palestinians. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, was founded in 1951 as a pro-Zionist lobby. It gained unrivaled power in 1967, and AIPAC's outsized influence over U.S. foreign policy continues to this day. More than 700,000 Israeli settlers, 10% of the nearly 7 million people in Israel, have been transferred into the occupied Palestinian territories, continuously terrorizing and displacing Palestinians from even more of their territory and engaging in pogroms against them. Outside of the liberal Zionist fold, Jewish dissent has ranged from the Marxist left to the ultra-Orthodox Neturei Karla. From opposite standpoints, both have rejected Zionism. Jews belonging to the Marxist left have espoused its militant secularism and have traditionally viewed Zionism as a racist form of bourgeois nationalism. Neturei Karla, founded in Jerusalem in 1938, insists that Zionism is not Judaism and that the entire concept of a sovereign Jewish state is contrary to Jewish law. Jewish law forbids believers to dominate, harm, kill, or demean another people, according to Neturei Karla. It requires them to give the land back to the Palestinians and to await the coming of the Messiah, who will usher in the reign of universal peace and brotherhood, not a harsh militaristic ethnic state. Marxists and Neturei Karla members often march in the same demonstrations against Israel's brutal treatment of Palestinians. Jewish Voice for Peace was founded in 1996 by several women students at UC Berkeley. In its 2002 mission statement, described JVP as a diverse and democratic community of activists inspired by Jewish tradition to work together for peace, social justice, and human rights. That statement lists JVP's goals as a U.S. foreign policy based on promoting peace, democracy, human rights, and respect for international law, an end to the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, a resolution of the Palestinian refugee problem consistent with international law and equity, and an end to all violence against civilian peace between the peoples in the region. Jewish Voice for Peace does not tolerate racist, sexist, homophobic, anti-Arab, or anti-Jewish language or imagery. JVP's guidelines specifically instructed members to avoid using the terms Zionism or anti-Zionism in either a positive or negative way. JVP took no position on one state or two states, but would support any reasonable solution that is acceptable to the majority of the people living in the region. Many of the contributors in the book belong to JVP, which has gradually evolved to adapt to changing circumstances. In 2003, JVP became the first Jewish organization to advocate boycotting the products of Israeli settlements as a means of ending the occupation, a move that subjected it to widespread censure. JVP has joined African Americans, Native Americans, immigrants, and Muslims in forging a broader movement in solidarity with Palestinians, one linked to the struggle for justice that people of color are waging here in the United States. I want to just give you a little sense of my story that is memorialized in my chapter in this collection. Although my family was not religious, I was raised to be proud of my Jewish heritage. My father had fought the Nazis in World War II, and relatives had perished in the Holocaust. My paternal grandmother was an activist against the Tsar during the pogroms in Lithuania, and she was on her way. She actually was on her way to Siberia, escaped. She was going to be incarcerated, escaped, and at the age of 18, got on a ship and sailed to the United States. We revered Israel as the homeland of the Jews. At the Passover Seder, we would raise our glasses and intone, "Next year in Jerusalem." At Sunday school, we gathered coins to plant trees in the Holy Land. In 1967, during my freshman year at Stanford, I came to oppose the war in Vietnam and joined the Resistance, an organization of draft resistors and their allies. The following year, I signed up for Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, but I was still unaware that the war Israel launched that same year completed its occupation of Palestine. At Stanford, after Stanford, I attended law school and became a people's lawyer. In 1971, I joined the National Lawyers Guild, a progressive political legal organization for which I later served as president. The Guild's guiding motto is, "Human rights are more sacred than property interests." It was in the Guild's International Committee that I came to know the facts about Israel's oppression of the Palestinians. Over the years, I have become sharply critical of Israel. I'm an active member of the Guild's Palestine Subcommittee. I write frequent articles and do media commentary about Israel's violations of international law. I am a proud member of Jewish Voice for Peace, and I work in support of the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, or BDS movement. In 1977, the Guild sent a delegation to Israel and Palestine. I didn't attend, but I read the report that it issued, the first comprehensive analysis of Israel's practices published by a non-governmental organization dedicated to the protection of human rights. The report documented violations of the 1949 Geneva Conventions by Israel. The stories of my colleagues and the allegations in that report disturbed me greatly. These were the first accounts I had read about Israel's mistreatment of the Palestinians, including house demolitions, administrative detentions with no charges indefinitely, and torture. The report documented beatings, burning with cigarettes, forced standing while naked for long periods exposed to heat or cold, dousing with hot or cold water, cutting the body with razor blades, biting by dogs, sensory deprivation, sodomizing with bottles or sticks, inserting wires into the penis, electric shocks to sensitive parts of the body, and suspension from the floor with hands or feet tied to a pulley device. Reading the case studies made me physically ill. A later Guild delegation detailed Israel's apartheid system, which reminded me of apartheid South Africa. Guild members went to the region and issued a report titled The Al-Aqsa Intifada and Israel's Apartheid, the U.S. Military and Economic Role in the Violation of Palestinian Human Rights. That report documented a system of apartheid in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, as well as the United States' uncritical support for Israel. And I should say that since then, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem have all documented apartheid in Israel. This Guild report covered illegal settlements, Jewish settlements on Palestinian land, and bypass roads, restricted movement of Palestinians, discriminatory land policies, differential treatment of Jews and Palestinian non-Jews, and Israeli policing of Palestinian political expression. It also analyzed indiscriminate and excessive use of lethal force against Palestinians, indiscriminate and excessive use of force against Palestinian property, delay and prevention of medical treatment, and collective punishment against the Palestinians, which constitutes a war crime under the Geneva Conventions. In fact, many of these things do. My activism and critical writings have followed a trajectory from Vietnam to South Africa, to Israel, to Iraq, to Afghanistan, and other countries where the United States conducts imperial military actions. When I publish articles critical of Israel, I invariably receive messages accusing me of being anti-Semitic, of being a self-hating Jew. Thus, I was pleased to read South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu's opinion in the Tampa Bay Times, where he wrote, "My voice will always be raised in support of Christian-Jewish ties and against the anti-Semitism that all sensible people fear and detest. But this cannot be an excuse for doing nothing and for standing aside as successive Israeli governments colonize the West Bank and advance racist laws." He noted that Israel's theft of Palestinian land and Jewish-only colonies built on Palestinian land violate international law. I am proud to say that, as Georgia mentioned, Archbishop Tutu wrote the foreword to my book, Drones and Targeted Killing, Legal, Moral, and Geopolitical Issues, in which he compared the struggle of students against South African apartheid to the anti-Vietnam War movement. It was after reading Tutu's letter to the editor in the New York Times about American exceptionalism that I invited him to introduce my book. During the recent ICJ hearing on the legality of Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory, the South African ambassador told the court that Israel had an even more extreme form of apartheid than we did in South Africa. There is a common Jewish saying, "Never again." It refers to the Holocaust, but it is happening again, this time by Israel, which is committing genocide against the Palestinian people. It is incumbent upon all of us, and no less so us in the Jewish community, to do everything in our power to stop that genocide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marjorie. This was just incredible. You answered every question I had, with the exception of one, which I'll ask before I open it up. But I look at all my string of questions, and every one of them you covered, except this one, and it's kind of it's not one you can have a definitive answer to, but I've been interested in your take. Why wasn't a two-state solution part of the creation of Israel? Why weren't there delineated areas for both countries? And do you see any possibility of this happening in the near future?
Well, when Israel was created out of whole Palestinian cloth, it was a homeland for the Jews and only the Jews. And in fact, Israel has a basic law that says that Jews have the right to self-determination in Israel, and they're the only ones that have the right to self-determination. There has been a lot of lip service given to the so-called two-state solution, and at one point that might have been possible, but with the increasing building of settlements on Palestinian land, Jewish settlements on Palestinian land, and the atomization of the Palestinians into Bantustans and the roads that separate them from Israel, and the barrier wall, which the ICJ ruled was illegal on Palestinian land, a two-state solution has become virtually impossible, notwithstanding the lip service that people, especially in the US government, have given to it. Another solution would be a one-state solution where Jews and Palestinians would live together in a democratic society where everyone had equal rights and there would be one person, one vote. That is not acceptable to the Israelis. That will not happen.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to open this up now for questions from people on the call. So if you want to ask something, please put your hand up. Howard, I see you have your hand up, so I'm calling on you.
Okay, as soon as I figure out how to run my computer, I'll be happy to chime in here.
You're on.
Thank you for your presentation, Marjorie. It was most enlightening. One question that will have no impact upon your position or my position or anyone else's relates to a situation I used to have where a very, very good friend of mine was one of the principal lobbyists for a group called AIPAC. And he and I would use the traditions of our younger years, where we would sit in the metaphorical deli and discuss the issue, but the discussions took the form that a casual onlooker might think we were on the verge of shooting each other. They were animated and very strong discussions, but with no animus whatsoever. And one of his principal arguments, when I would take essentially your position, was that much of the land that the Jews took during the Nakba and so on and so forth was actually purchased by the Jews. It was their land. That was his argument. And in my understanding, that may have been true in one or two cases, but for the most part, it's a ridiculous statement. Can you comment on that?
On a Zoom connection, where do I find?
Kimberly, you need to be muted.
That land was given to the Jews. The UN made that decision, and the idea that Jews bought the land, I think, is preposterous. And I want to say that I have lost a number of friends, close friends, especially recently, but even years ago when I was supporting when I started supporting the BDS movement, there is an expression called PEP, P-E-P. I don't know how many of you have heard about it. Generally, Jews are liberal, they're Democrats, they believe in social justice. I know this is a kind of a generalization, but PEP means progressive except Palestine. And I can't tell you how many relatives I have and close friends, some of them former close friends, who are really progressive about everything but do not want to hear the facts about what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. It's an emotional thing. They're not even religious necessarily. And some of them are atheists, but they have this view of Israel as the homeland of the Jews, and nothing can shake them from that belief. And I think that that kind of entrenchment is really emblematic of what we're seeing now on a much larger scale in reaction to Israel's very transparent, very ubiquitous genocide. It's now gone on for 8 months and it's still going strong.
Thanks. Josette?
Yeah, I basically have two questions. If it's not realistic that there is a two-state solution, what would be a realistic vision? And second, how do we, as the voting public and as Americans, what is the most effective way for us to influence our politicians to view this from the perspective of reality? And you presented things today that even beyond what I knew before, and it's just amazing. So I hope you can answer that.
Yeah, Josette, those are really good questions. As I said, a one-state solution would be the democratic solution, and I think the Palestinians would be very happy with that solution, but the Jews will never go for that. The Israelis will never go for that. I think, to be honest with you, this is, I know there are a lot of intractable conflicts in the world. There's Ukraine and Russia, and there are all kinds of China, Taiwan. There's so many conflicts. I don't think any of them are as impossible as this situation. I wish that I could be more optimistic, but I do think, to go to the second part of your question, that the only way that anything is going to really change is through pressure from civil society. And that is, and of course, the courts are not a panacea, but the fact that the ICJ has found a plausible case of genocide, the fact that the ICC, after dragging its feet for 7 years doing an investigation, finally is the chief prosecutors asking for arrest warrants against Netanyahu, Gallant, and 3 Hamas leaders, has brought into the fore exactly what's happening in a very stark way, and has provided fuel to millions of people around the world, including bless their hearts, the students all over this country and in other countries as well, to demand an end to this genocide. And so my feeling is that the most important thing is, well, there are several things, but boycott, divestment, and sanctions is really important. It was launched in 2005 by Palestinian civil society to boycott products that fuel the Israeli occupation, divest from companies and corporations that are invested in Israel and the occupied territories, and push for sanctions against Israel. And it's a nonviolent movement, and it's to last until Israel provides equal rights for Palestinians, stops violating international law, allows the Palestinians to return to their land as stipulated in General Assembly Resolution 194, etc. Now, BDS has been so effective in really is constituting a blow to the Israeli economy that Netanyahu at one point called it an existential threat to Israel. I suggest that you look up BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, go on that website, find out what those products are that are on the boycott list, and spread that throughout your contact list. And I think that our leaders have to hear from us, and that is the White House, and that is members of Congress. They need to be barraged with demands for an arms embargo and sanctions against Israel. That Israel, I mean, I haven't really touched on this much, but there is no way that Israel could carry out its genocide, settler colonialism, apartheid, and oppression of the Palestinians without the wholehearted, full-throated support of the US government. That is just a fact. The US government provides $3.8 billion a year in military assistance to Israel, and billions more have been provided since it started its genocide. And when Biden says, oh, you really ought to be careful and not hurt civilians, and in one breath, and then sends billions of dollars in weapons to Israel. So we need to make our voices heard. And if you're Jewish, you can join groups like Jewish Voice for Peace. There are many other organizations as well that, and there, I think there are non-Jewish members of Jewish Voice for Peace as well. There are many refuseniks in the Israeli military who refuse to carry out orders to oppress the Palestinians. So that's kind of a long answer, but that's.
Well, you touched on another
No,
thing, the
it's a good
US
answer.
war economy, which is part of the ongoing problem. Mike has his hand up. Mike? Oops.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, great.
Wow. Well, first of all, thank you. That was an incredible presentation. I heard a few things that I'd never heard before. You answered the question about the U.S. support. That was one part of my question. Could this possibly happen without U.S. support? Basically, you said a lot of things that my older brother's been telling me for many, many, many years. And I've been fighting with him about that in many ways, but he always wins. But so when genocide, when I think of genocide, when I argue with my brother about this type of thing or other people, my first thought goes right to the Nazis and millions and millions and millions of innocent people just being murdered and tortured and gassed and dying. That's what I think of. So I when I constantly hear the word genocide here, I mean, what you said today explains it better. I don't know exactly when you would say, if you could just describe again, briefly, like you did, what a genocide is and what year you think this genocide actually started. Was it 1947? That's just part of my question. And then I'll just say, if it's humanly possible, it's kind of a weird thing to say that, you know, how they do it in politics on the things that you get for the elections. If there's a rebuttal to everything you just said, I'd be curious to hear somebody do that rebuttal. I don't doubt everything you're saying. I think it was an incredible presentation. I don't doubt your intelligence on this issue for a minute, but I'm just wondering, you must get in arguments. Well, obviously you do. You said you did with people who fight you on this and this PEP thing. And so I wonder if anybody would ever have a rebuttal to everything that you just said today on that incredible presentation that you gave. That's basically all I want to say.
Well,
And the
thank you.
definition- Sorry, and the definition of genocide also.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for those questions. And to take the last one first, I've actually provided you with a rebuttal to the corporate media. It's ubiquitous. Pick up the New York Times, the LA Times, look at APEC's website, look at most of even a lot of the corporate media has a hard time rationalizing the genocide that's happening there. But it is all over the place. And my analysis, if you want to dig deeper, and I urge you to buy the book because a lot of my presentation was based on the book. But I write, as Georgia said, a regular column for Truth Out, and all of my articles, videos, books, etc., are collected on my website, marjoriecohn.com. Now, in terms of your genocide, when did it begin? Yes, it began in 1947. And the definition of genocide, which is contained in the Genocide Convention, requires two things. I'm a criminal defense lawyer, by the way, retired criminal defense lawyer, recovering criminal defense lawyer. And in order, I don't know if there are any other lawyers here, but in order to have a crime, you need two things. You need an act and you need an intent. The intent to commit genocide is proved in spades by statements from high Israeli officials calling Palestinians animals, saying that life will never be the same. They're going to wipe out all the Palestinians. You know, there are so many, and these are in my articles as well, many examples of genocidal intent. Most of the time, when you're talking about a crime, you don't have the suspect or the defendant stating his or her intent to commit the crime. You rarely have someone say, I intend to commit murder, or I intend to commit a robbery. I mean, sometimes you do, but most of the time you don't. You have to use circumstantial evidence to figure it out. Here we've got statement after statement after statement. And if you go to marjoriecohn.com, put in the search box genocide, right away you'll come up with the definition. So that's the intent part of it, the mental element of genocide. The other element of genocide is the act, genocidal acts. And genocidal acts can be either killing members of the group, subjecting them to great bodily injury, or creating the conditions of life that would lead to the destruction in whole or in part of that group. Those are the possible, and these are in the Genocide Convention, and they're also in the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court. So in order to convict someone of genocide, it must meet this definition of genocide. And by the way, one thing I should mention that I have not seen almost anywhere, although I've mentioned it in articles and in interviews, is that while the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court showed great courage in asking for arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant and 3 Hamas leaders, they were for war crimes and crimes against humanity, not genocide, even though the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, the World Court, not the ICC, the criminal court, found a plausible case of genocide. And the Rome Statute punishes 4 different crimes, the most atrocious of all crimes: war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and the crime of aggression. And yet we don't see charges of genocide being requested by the ICC prosecutor. Hope that answers your question.
Yes, now I'm going to go to Faye. This may be our last question because we're running out of the hour, but Faye, go ahead.
There we go. Yeah. You mentioned kind of looking to the future, and you said that the 2-state solution was no longer possible because of the settlements and the expansion. And I was there on a trip with the International Peace Builders in 2005 in the West Bank, and I thought, you know, the settlements were everywhere, and how do you unscramble an egg in order to create a 2-state solution? On the other hand, you say that Israel, the Jewish population of Israel, would never accept a 1-state solution. So where are we? And I just wanted to offer an idea that's been put forth by a group called A Land for All, and their website is alandforall.org. And what they're talking about is something I heard Jeff Halper, who you may know as a peace activist, an Israeli-American peace activist, where you live may not be the same as citizenship. In other words, people would not have to move. They could stay, the settlers could stay, but be citizens of Israel as long as they obeyed the laws of Palestine, and Palestinians could be the reverse. I think this situation requires getting creative and not thinking along the same lines that we thought of before. So I just want to offer this to people. Their main principles are democracy for all, freedom for movement for all, sovereignty for all, homeland for all, justice for all, Jerusalem for all, and security for all. And I think that's the type of thing that we need to work towards.
Well, thank you for that, Faye. I think that ideally those are all laudable goals, but in terms of allowing Jews to remain in the settlements on Palestinian land, I think that's a no starter. And the settlers, with the backup of the Israeli government, have been they're very racist against the Palestinians, and they kill Palestinians and they torture them and they abuse them. And you can't just, snap your fingers and that's going to end. So whereas those are laudable principles, that's another way of saying a one state solution, but allowing and a lot of people are talking about going back to the 1967 borders. In other words, ending the occupation of
Yeah.
the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. But it's a really, really difficult situation. I think there is, and I study this all the time. I don't see anything in the world that even comes close to the difficulty of reconciling this. But one thing we can do is to get our government to stop enabling it, stop funding it, and stop allowing this genocide to happen right before our very eyes.
Right.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Marjorie. I think we have gone past the hour, and I really appreciate the time you've taken with us and this brilliant presentation. Really.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Georgia, and thank you all for coming and for your great questions. And we just have to continue struggling. We really do. I just don't see how people can turn their head away from the tragedy that's happening now in Gaza and in the West Bank.
Indeed.
Thank you. It was fantastic.
Yeah, great. Well, what we're going to do now, I will stop the recording